The Galactic University and Humanity's Hazardous Reputation. The Galactic University was the pinnacle of higher education across the known universe. It boasted students from every corner of the galaxy, beings from frozen moons, living gas giants, and molten planets, all congregated to learn in an environment where the brightest minds thrived. Its courses were known to be difficult, and only the most resilient species could attend. The university was housed on a massive space station located in neutral space, orbiting a dim star in a quiet sector. It symbolized unity, knowledge, and a shared curiosity for the mysteries of the cosmos. However, despite the diversity of species, there was always one name that invoked a mix of awe and fear: humanity. Sarah Thompson, a human exchange student, was well aware of her species' reputation. She had gotten used to the side glances, the whispered conversations, and the occasionally nervous distance her classmates maintained. Humans, after all, were classified as a Class 12 hazardous species, the only intelligent beings from a death world who had not just survived, but flourished on a planet filled with danger at every turn. Earth's classification as a death world stemmed from its unpredictable and often lethal environment. From volatile weather to apex predators and dangerous flora, it was considered a planet designed to kill anything that dared to let its guard down. Today's class was no exception. The lecture hall buzzed with anticipation as Professor Zill, a towering gelatinous being with multiple eyes that seemed to float within his translucent form, prepared to start the day's lesson. His tentacles moved lazily through the air, adjusting floating holoscreens around him as he prepared his materials. "Today, class," he began, his voice a strange mix of burbling and gravitas, "we will be discussing Class 12 hazardous species and why humans, despite their primitive origins, have managed to not only survive but thrive in environments that would decimate most life forms." The alien students watched in rapt attention. For many of them, humans were an enigma. They had heard stories, whispers in the dormitories, tales passed down through media and galactic history. But hearing it from a professor at the university lent a new weight to the mythos surrounding Earthlings. Professor Zill continued, "As you know, the galactic classification system rates planets based on their danger level. Class 1 is the safest, a planet where life can thrive with minimal adaptation. Class 12, however," his tentacles gestured dramatically, "that's where humans come from. It is a world where not just the environment, but the very creatures living on it seem to have been designed for survival through hostility." A brave Zorian in the front row, a gelatinous being with several eye stalks, raised a pseudopod timidly. "Professor, if humans are so dangerous, why are they allowed to attend the Galactic University at all?" The professor's eye stalks all turned toward the student in unison, a look of amusement crossing his many faces. "Ah, an excellent question. You see, despite their robust constitution, humans have shown a remarkable ability to adapt to diplomacy and interspecies cooperation. Plus," he added with a chuckle that sent ripples through his form, "their tuition fees are astronomical. The Board of Regents couldn't resist." The class erupted in a ripple of nervous laughter, but one student in the back, Sarah, merely sighed and rolled her eyes. Being treated like a walking disaster was something she had grown used to, though it didn't make it any less irritating. "Now then," the professor continued, oblivious to her reaction, "let's move on to today's topic, Extreme Survival 1001. This course is designed to prepare you for the most dangerous environments in the galaxy. We'll be covering everything from acidic atmospheres to toxic rainstorms." As the professor's voice droned on about extreme hazards, Sarah found her mind wandering. She had heard this lecture before. Back on Earth, they called it Tuesday. Her stomach rumbled slightly as she thought about lunch and wondered what the cafeteria had in store. She barely noticed when the entire room seemed to jolt to attention with panicked chittering from her classmates. The words "field trip" snapped Sarah back to reality. "Wait, what?" she muttered. The professor's voice boomed with glee. "That's right, class. Next week, we'll be taking a field trip to Hox." The mention of Hawks sent a wave of panic through the alien students. Many of them visibly shuddered, and a few even emitted high-pitched squeaks of distress. To most species, Hawks was a planet of nightmares, a Class 1 death world, far more hazardous than Earth. But Sarah merely raised an eyebrow. Hawks? That didn't sound so bad. A bit cold, maybe, but nothing a good jacket couldn't handle. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, and the students scrambled out of the room in varying states of panic. Sarah, curious about the reaction of her classmates, made her way to Professor Zill's desk. "Excuse me, Professor," she said. "I couldn't help but notice that everyone seems a bit freaked out about this field trip. Is there something I'm missing?" Professor Zill's tentacles wriggled in what Sarah had come to recognize as his species' version of a chuckle. "Ah, Miss Thompson, I sometimes forget that you are not familiar with our galactic classification system. Hawks is what we call a Class 1 death world, the most inhospitable type of planet in the known universe." Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion. "But isn't Earth classified as a death world too?" The professor nodded. "Indeed it is. A Class 12, to be precise. The difference, however, is that Earth is more of a passive-aggressive killer. Hawks, on the other hand, actively tries to murder you every second you are there." Sarah stifled a laugh. "Well, when you put it that way, what shall I expect on this field trip?" The professor's eye stalks swiveled toward her with a mischievous glint. "Oh, nothing too unusual. Just temperatures hovering around absolute zero, gravity 3 times that of standard, an atmosphere so thick you could swim through it, if it weren't also corrosive. And let's not forget the local wildlife. They view anything that moves as a potential meal." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Sounds like a typical Tuesday in Australia. Do I need to bring anything special?" Professor Zill stared at her for a moment before bursting into gelatinous laughter. "Oh, Miss Thompson, your species never ceases to amaze me. No, the university will provide all the necessary survival gear. Just bring yourself and a positive attitude." As Sarah left the classroom, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of excitement. The field trip sounded like it was going to be a lot more interesting than she had initially thought. Sure, her alien classmates were terrified, but Sarah knew better. She had grown up on Earth, a world filled with venomous snakes, deadly insects, extreme climates, and the occasional natural disaster. What could be worse than that? Next week was going to be fun. A week passed quickly, and Sarah found herself crammed into a cramped transport ship alongside her alien classmates. The ship hummed with the nervous energy of students about to face what they believed was certain doom. The chatter of various alien languages filled the air, punctuated by the occasional squeak of anxiety. The trip to Hawks, the galaxy's deadliest planet, had most of her fellow students on edge. Sarah, on the other hand, felt oddly calm. She glanced around at her classmates, many of whom were so bundled up in layers of protective suits they resembled colorful marshmallows. Their protective suits were reinforced with specialized materials that would shield them from Hawks' extreme conditions. Meanwhile, Sarah had been issued a slightly bulkier version of a standard spacesuit, nothing she wasn't already used to. She felt a little out of place among the rest of the terrified students who had spent the last few days cramming survival protocols into their heads like it was an exam. As the ship began its descent, Professor Zill's voice came over the comm system, startling everyone out of their anxious conversations. "All right, class, we'll be touching down on Hawks in approximately 5 minutes. Remember your training, stay with your assigned groups, and most importantly, don't try to pet the local wildlife. I know they may look adorable, but they are quite eager to disembowel anything that moves." The professor's attempt at humor was met with silence, save for a few nervous chuckles. Sarah smirked. He wasn't wrong, though. Death-world creatures had a certain charm about them, if you didn't mind the fact that most of them were trying to kill you. Sarah's seatmate, a gleer named Zix, turned to her with wide, terrified eyes. His tentacles were shaking, and his skin had taken on a paler hue than usual. "How are you so calm?" he asked, his voice trembling. We're about to land on the most dangerous planet in the galaxy. Sarah patted one of his shaking tentacles reassuringly. Relax, it can't be any worse than Black Friday shopping back on Earth. Blinked at her, confused. Black Friday, what's that? Sarah grinned. It's a day when humans turn shopping into a blood sport. Trust me, after you've survived that, Hox is nothing. Before Zix could process what she had said, the ship landed with a bone-rattling thud. The doors hissed open, and a blast of frigid air rushed in, instantly freezing the moisture in the air and creating a brief but beautiful flurry of indoor snow. The landscape outside was a nightmarish blend of frozen tundra and active volcanoes, with geysers of liquid methane shooting into the sky at random intervals. Dark, towering mountains loomed in the distance, their jagged peaks disappearing into thick clouds that roiled like a boiling ocean. Professor Zill's voice crackled over the comms once more, now slightly muffled by the thick layers of protective gear he wore. Welcome to Hox, class. Now let's begin our tour, shall we? As Sarah stepped off the ship, her boots crunched against the frozen ground, and she immediately felt the crushing weight of the planet's gravity. The force was nearly 3 times what she was used to on Earth, making each step feel like wading through thick mud. Around her, her alien classmates stumbled and struggled to stay upright under the weight. Some let out panicked squeals, while others muttered curses in their native languages. Sarah adjusted her stance, feeling the heavy gravity press down on her like a lead blanket. It was uncomfortable, sure, but not unbearable. She had trained in a variety of gravity simulators back on Earth, and this was just another challenge. ZX, on the other hand, was faring much worse. He staggered beside her, his multiple limbs flailing as he tried to maintain balance. His tentacles splayed out on the ground as he gasped for breath. "This is impossible," he panted. How are you still standing?" Sarah chuckled, offering him a hand to steady himself. "Just take it slow, one step at a time. You'll get the hang of it." As they continued their march across the icy landscape, Sarah found herself both in awe and on high alert. The atmosphere was thick, almost syrupy, and the air had a distinct, bitter taste. Every breath felt like inhaling through a filter clogged with debris. The cold was biting, seeping through her suit despite its insulation, and the wind howled like a living entity, slashing through the landscape with relentless fury. But what truly caught Sarah's attention was the wildlife. In the distance, she saw massive 6-legged creatures, resembling woolly mammoths, but with razor-sharp tusks and glowing red eyes, slowly trudging across the frozen plains. They moved with a predatory grace, their breaths visible in the frigid air like plumes of smoke. Sarah couldn't help but be impressed by their sheer size and strength. Her classmates, on the other hand, were far less enthusiastic. Professor ZL led the group through a series of survival drills as they trudged across the planet's surface. The first lesson was on proper breathing techniques in a corrosive atmosphere. "Everyone, remove your helmets," the professor called out cheerfully. There was an immediate wave of protest from the students. Panicked squeaks, chirps, and even a mournful hum filled the air as they stared at him in horror. Sarah raised her hand. Professor, quick question. Are you insane, or just trying to kill us?" The professor's eye stalks turned toward her, amusement glimmering in his gelatinous orbs. Miss Thompson, always with the humor. Of course, I'm not asking you to actually remove your helmets. This is merely a thought experiment on how to maintain composure in high-stress environments. The students relaxed, but their eyes still flicked nervously toward the roiling clouds overhead and the distant howls of creatures unseen. As the day wore on, Sarah found herself growing more intrigued by Hox. Yes, the gravity was oppressive, the atmosphere toxic, and the wildlife dangerous, but it reminded her of home in an odd way. The unpredictability, the challenge, it was exhilarating. Her alien classmates, on the other hand, looked increasingly drained, their initial terror replaced by sheer exhaustion. Many were struggling to keep up with the pace, their bodies unused to the constant strain. When the group finally reached their first rest point, a small outcropping of rock that provided minimal shelter from the relentless wind, Professor Zill instructed the class to take a break. Sarah sat down and stretched, her muscles aching from the heavy gravity. Zix collapsed beside her, looking utterly defeated. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," he groaned, his tentacles twitching weakly. "This planet is trying to kill us." Sarah nodded in agreement but grinned. "Yeah, it's pretty intense. But don't worry, we humans are good at surviving this kind of stuff. Stick with me and you'll be fine." Zix gave her a weak smile. "I don't understand how your species manages this all the time. Earth must be a nightmare." Sarah laughed. "It can be, sometimes, but you get used to it, and once you do, places like Hox don't seem so bad." As the break ended and the group prepared to continue their trek, Sarah felt a surge of determination. This field trip was shaping up to be far more interesting than she had anticipated. Hox might be the galaxy's deadliest planet, but to her, it was just another survival course, and she was ready to ace it. The journey across the frozen wasteland continued, with each step pushing Sarah and her classmates to their limits. But while her alien peers grew more fearful and fatigued, Sarah felt a strange sense of confidence growing within her. Hox, for all its dangers, was just another test. And if there was one thing humanity excelled at, it was rising to the challenge. The deeper they ventured into the heart of the planet, the more Sarah realized that this wasn't just a field trip. It was an opportunity to prove what humans were truly capable of. And as the wind howled and the ground shook beneath her feet, she couldn't help but smile. This was going to be fun. A test of survival, facing the unknown. The oppressive gravity of Hox seemed to intensify as Sarah and her classmates continued their trek across the frozen landscape. Each step was a challenge, as though the planet itself was testing their will to survive. Sarah could feel the weight in her legs, a dull ache growing with every mile, but she kept pushing forward, driven by the thrill of the unknown. Around her, the other students weren't faring as well. Zix, who had started off with a tentative optimism after their break, was now dragging himself along, barely able to keep up. The rest of the group looked no better. Their colorful, marshmallow-like forms were slumping, their movements sluggish. Some had resorted to clinging to each other for support, their fear of Hox's deadly environment outweighing their pride. Professor Zill floated ahead of them, seemingly unaffected by the planet's hostile conditions, his many tentacles gliding across the ground. His gelatinous form shimmered under the strange, dim light of the Hoxian sun. Every so often, he'd glance back at the group, offering words of encouragement that did little to soothe their anxiety. "Keep moving, class. We've only a few more miles to our next objective. Remember your training, and you'll be fine." Sarah smiled to herself, knowing that training was relative. Most of her classmates had come from far more comfortable planets, places where the air was breathable, the gravity manageable, and the wildlife more inclined to run away than attack. Earth, on the other hand, had toughened her in ways they couldn't understand. While she wasn't immune to the discomfort of Hox, she knew she could handle it. They soon reached the mouth of a narrow canyon, its rocky walls towering high above them like the jaws of some great beast. The wind here was less severe, but the temperature had dropped even further. Sarah's breath formed thick clouds in the air, and the frost clinging to the canyon walls glittered like diamonds. "This," Professor Zill announced, "is our first major challenge. Navigating the Dead Canyon. It's a treacherous path, known for sudden ice slides and methane eruptions. Stick close, and whatever you do, don't stray from the marked trail." A ripple of unease spread through the group. Ice slides, methane eruptions. The alien students exchanged nervous glances, their fear palpable. Zix, shivering next to Sarah, whispered, "This is insane. We're going to die here." Sarah chuckled softly, patting his tentacle once more. "Come on, Zix. It's just a canyon. We'll be fine as long as we stick together." But as they entered the canyon, the atmosphere changed. The air became even thicker, harder to breathe, and every sound echoed eerily off the canyon walls, amplifying their footsteps and the occasional distant rumble. The ground beneath them was slick with ice, and Sarah had to concentrate on keeping her balance as the gravity pressed down on her. For a while, things went smoothly. They followed Professor Zill's lead, carefully navigating the treacherous path. But then, without warning, a deafening roar echoed through the canyon. The ground trembled violently, and a massive geyser of liquid methane erupted from a fissure in the ice, shooting high into the air. "Watch out," Sarah shouted, grabbing Zix and pulling him to safety as the methane geyser sprayed dangerously close to their path. The other students screamed in panic, scrambling to avoid the deadly spray. "We need to move faster," Sarah called out, her voice barely audible over the noise. The geyser died down, but the tremors continued, shaking the canyon walls. Sarah glanced up and saw cracks forming in the ice above them. It was only a matter of time before it came crashing down. "Everyone stay calm," Professor Zill ordered, though his voice lacked its usual calm confidence. "Keep moving, stay close to the walls." The group hurried forward, but it was clear that fear had taken hold. Some students were stumbling, their movements erratic as they tried to flee the collapsing canyon. Zix was practically hanging on to Sarah, his tentacles wrapping around her arm as he struggled to stay upright. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, and Sarah looked up just in time to see a massive chunk of ice break free from the canyon wall. It was plummeting straight toward them. "Move," Sarah yelled, pushing Zix out of the way as she dove to the side. The ice slammed into the ground where they had just been standing, shattering into 1,000 pieces. For a moment, everything was chaos. Screams, the roar of falling ice, the tremors beneath their feet. But somehow Sarah and the others managed to avoid the worst of it. When the dust finally settled, Sarah found herself panting, her heart racing. She glanced around and saw that the group was scattered, some of the students still frozen in fear, others huddling together. Zix was on the ground next to her, looking pale and shaken, but otherwise unharmed. Professor Zill floated over, his eye stalks scanning the scene. "Well done, class," he said, though his voice was a bit more strained than usual. "I told you, as long as we stick to the path, we'll be fine." Sarah couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Fine. They had just barely survived a methane eruption and a deadly icefall, and the professor still had the nerve to act like it was all part of the plan. Typical. The group regrouped, shaken but alive, and continued their trek through the canyon. The tremors subsided, and the path ahead seemed more stable, though Sarah knew better than to let her guard down. Hox was unpredictable, and every step felt like walking on the edge of a knife. As they neared the end of the canyon, Sarah felt a strange sense of pride. She had faced worse back on Earth, but seeing how her classmates had struggled, she realized just how tough humans really were. Even here, on the galaxy's deadliest planet, she felt like she could handle whatever was thrown at her. Finally, they emerged from the canyon and found themselves on a vast open plain. The wind was still howling, and the temperature was still freezing, but the sky had cleared, revealing a breathtaking view of the planet's rugged landscape. In the distance, massive volcanoes spewed clouds of ash and molten rock into the sky, their fiery glow casting an eerie light across the frozen tundra. "Congratulations, class," Professor Zill said, his voice filled with genuine pride. "You've made it through the first stage of our survival course, but the real test is just beginning." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Wait, that wasn't the real test." The professor's eye stalks swiveled toward her, and for the first time, she saw a glint of mischief in his gelatinous eyes. "Oh, no, Miss Thompson. That was merely the warm-up. Now, we move on to the true challenge." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, there was a sudden rumble beneath their feet, and the ground began to shake violently. In the distance, one of the volcanoes erupted, sending a massive plume of ash and lava high into the sky. Sarah's eyes widened. This wasn't just another survival drill. This was the real thing. "Everyone to the shelters," Professor Zill shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the eruption. "Stay together and move quickly." The group broke into a sprint, their exhaustion forgotten as the threat of imminent death loomed over them. Sarah's muscles burned from the effort, but she kept running, pushing herself harder than she ever had before. Six was right beside her, his fear giving him a burst of adrenaline as they raced across the frozen plain. The shelters were just ahead, small, reinforced domes designed to withstand the planet's worst conditions. But the ground was cracking beneath them, fissures opening up as the planet seemed to tear itself apart. Sarah could feel the heat from the approaching lava, the air thick with ash and smoke. Her lungs burned, her vision blurred, but she kept going, her focus locked on the shelters. Finally, they reached the domes, and one by one, the students scrambled inside, gasping for breath. Sarah collapsed onto the floor, her body trembling from the exertion. But they had made it. Somehow, against all odds, they had survived. As the doors sealed shut and the sound of the eruption was muffled by the thick walls of the shelter, Sarah looked around at her classmates. They were battered, exhausted, and terrified, but they were alive. Professor Zill floated into the center of the room, his usual calm demeanor returning. "Well done, class. You've passed the first true test of survival, but don't get too comfortable. We have a long way to go." Sarah leaned back, her heart still racing, and smiled to herself. This was just the beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next. Into the heart of danger. As the shelter's walls hummed quietly, the class huddled inside, still recovering from the volcanic eruption. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the day's dangers pressing on everyone's minds. Sarah, though exhausted, couldn't help but feel a thrill of excitement. Hox was every bit the death world it had been promised to be, and somehow she was thriving. Professor Zill floated before the group, his eye stalks twitching as he surveyed his students. "You've done well so far, but the true heart of this survival course lies ahead. Tomorrow, we will journey into the Crater of Shadows, the most dangerous region on Hox." A ripple of unease spread through the group. Even Sarah felt a twinge of nervousness. She'd heard stories about the crater, a place where the planet's gravitational anomalies and unpredictable weather patterns combined to create a deadly, ever-shifting environment. "Get some rest," the professor continued. "You'll need all your strength for what lies ahead." That night, as the shelter's lights dimmed and the harsh winds of Hox howled outside, Sarah found herself lying awake, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow would be the ultimate test, not just of survival, but of human resilience. She was ready, but Hox still had more surprises in store. The Crater of Shadows. The next morning, the class stood at the edge of the Crater of Shadows, its vast, jagged expanse stretching out before them. Dark clouds churned above, swirling violently as gusts of wind howled across the crater's surface. The ground seemed to shift underfoot, as if the planet itself were alive and trying to shake them off. Sarah adjusted her suit, her eyes scanning the alien landscape. Around her, the alien students were tense, their fear almost palpable. Even Professor Zill, usually so confident, seemed uneasy. "Remember your training," Zill said, his voice firm despite the chaos. "In the crater, gravity shifts can occur at any moment. Keep close, stay alert, and watch your footing." The group began their descent, navigating the steep, crumbling path that led into the heart of the crater. The deeper they went, the stranger the environment became. Gravity fluctuated unpredictably. One moment they were light as feathers, the next they were struggling to lift their feet from the ground. "Stick together," Zill called out as the class started to drift apart. The gravity shifts were disorienting, pulling the group in different directions. Sarah stayed focused, her instincts guiding her through the erratic terrain. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the crater, followed by a tremor that rippled beneath their feet. Rocks tumbled down from the crater walls, and the ground began to split apart. "Get down," Sarah yelled, diving for cover as a massive boulder crashed where she had been standing moments before. The other students followed suit, scrambling to avoid the falling debris. The ground beneath them shifted again, this time pulling them toward the center of the crater. Sarah fought to keep her balance, her boots sinking into the soft, shifting earth. Around her, the alien students were struggling, some of them panicking as they were dragged toward the center. "Professor," one of the students shouted, "we're going to be crushed." But Zil was already moving, his tentacles propelling him forward with surprising speed. "Hold on," he called out, activating a device on his wrist. A shimmering force field expanded around the group, creating a protective barrier that stabilized the gravity around them. The sudden calm was disorienting. Sarah blinked, her body still bracing for the chaos that had just passed. The other students collapsed in relief, gasping for breath. "Is everyone okay?" Zil asked, scanning the group with concern. There were a few scrapes and bruises, but nothing serious. Sarah stood, her eyes narrowing as she gazed toward the center of the crater. There, in the distance, was something strange, a structure, half buried in the shifting earth. It didn't look natural. "Professor," Sarah said, pointing toward the anomaly. "What's that?" Zil turned to look, his eye stalks twitching in surprise. "That is not supposed to be here." The group cautiously approached the structure. As they drew closer, it became clear that it was some kind of ancient building, massive and crumbling, with intricate designs carved into its stone surface. "This must be a relic of an ancient civilization," Zil mused, his voice filled with awe. "The records say nothing about a civilization here on Hox." Sarah stepped forward, drawn to the structure. There was something about it, something that felt familiar. She reached out, her hand brushing against the cold stone's surface. The moment she touched it, the ground beneath her feet began to rumble once more. Before anyone could react, the structure came to life, its ancient mechanisms whirring to life with a deep, resonant hum. A doorway opened in the side of the building, revealing a dark, foreboding passage that seemed to lead deep underground. "Well, this wasn't in the syllabus," Sarah muttered. Zil floated closer, his curiosity piqued. "We must investigate. This could be the discovery of the century." The alien students exchanged nervous glances, but Sarah was already moving toward the doorway. Whatever lay inside, it felt important, like this was what they were truly here to find. The group entered the passage, the air growing colder as they descended into the unknown. The walls were lined with strange symbols, glowing faintly in the dim light. It was as if the entire structure had been waiting for their arrival. As they ventured deeper, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. The atmosphere was thick with tension, each step echoing through the ancient halls. Then, without warning, the ground shook again, this time with much greater force. The passage began to collapse, stones falling from the ceiling. "Run!" Sarah shouted, grabbing the arm of the nearest student and pulling them forward. The group sprinted down the corridor, the rumbling growing louder with each passing second. They burst into a large chamber, just as the passage behind them collapsed completely, sealing them inside. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in shadow. At its center stood a massive, glowing obelisk, pulsating with energy. "What is this place?" one of the students whispered, their voice trembling. Zil hovered closer to the obelisk, his eyes wide with amazement. This is beyond anything I've ever seen. We must be cautious." But before he could say anything more, the obelisk's glow intensified, filling the chamber with blinding light. A voice echoed through the air, ancient, powerful, and utterly alien. "Who dares awaken us?" The group froze, fear gripping them as the voice reverberated through their minds. Sarah felt her heart race, but she forced herself to stay calm. "We didn't mean to disturb you," she said, stepping forward. "We're just trying to survive." The voice paused, as if considering her words. Then it spoke again, softer this time. "You seek survival in a place of death. Perhaps you are more like us than you know." The chamber fell silent, the glow from the obelisk fading slightly. Whatever force had been watching them was now paying close attention. And Sarah had the distinct feeling that their journey had only just begun. The final test. The chamber remained eerily quiet, the only sound being the faint hum of the obelisk at its center. Sarah stood still, her heart pounding as she faced whatever ancient force had spoken to them. The alien students behind her were frozen in fear, and even Professor Zill seemed at a loss for words. "We mean no harm," Sarah said again, her voice steady. "We're just explorers, students, trying to learn about this world." The air around them shimmered, and the voice returned, deep and resonant. "You stand in the heart of what was once a great empire. We too were students once, seeking knowledge. But knowledge has a cost." The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the obelisk began to pulse more rapidly. A low rumble echoed through the chamber, as if the very planet was responding to the entity's words. "Your survival will be your test. Prove your worth, or be consumed by the shadows of this place." Without warning, the obelisk released a surge of energy that filled the room. The temperature dropped, and the walls seemed to close in, as if the chamber itself was alive. The group had only moments to react before the ancient structure began to collapse around them. "Move," Sarah yelled, pulling her classmates toward an exit they hadn't noticed before, a narrow passage leading upward. Rocks fell from the ceiling, and the walls cracked as they scrambled to escape. Professor Zill hovered close, guiding the panicked students forward. "Stay together. The passage should lead us to the surface." As they sprinted through the crumbling structure, Sarah could feel the weight of the entity's challenge bearing down on them. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was a test of everything they had learned. Every skill, every moment of training would determine if they made it out alive. The passage twisted and turned, and the group had to dodge falling debris at every corner. The sound of the structure collapsing behind them grew louder, and the ground shook beneath their feet. But Sarah refused to slow down. She knew they were close. At last, they emerged into the open air, gasping for breath. The crater lay before them, still chaotic, but far less threatening than the nightmare they had just escaped. The ancient structure groaned behind them, then collapsed entirely, sending a cloud of dust into the air. The group stood in stunned silence, staring at the ruins of what had once been a powerful empire. The test was over, and they had survived. Professor Zill floated to Sarah's side, his eye stalks trembling slightly. "I don't know how you did it, Miss Thompson, but you've passed the ultimate survival course." Sarah smiled, still catching her breath. "Guess humans really are built for this kind of thing." The class shared a nervous laugh, the tension finally breaking as they realized they had made it. The crater, the ruins, the voice, they were all behind them now. But the experience had changed them, and Sarah knew they would never forget what they had discovered here on Hox. As they boarded the transport ship and left the death world behind, Sarah glanced back at the crater one last time. The ancient empire may have been gone, but its lessons lived on, lessons of survival, resilience, and the unrelenting human spirit. The journey had been long and dangerous, but in the end, they had proven themselves worthy. And as the ship rocketed away from Hox, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what other worlds awaited them, and what other tests lay ahead.